There are nights you never forget, not because something beautiful happened, but because something walked through a door and looked you in the eyes, and you knew, in every bone of your body, that you were looking at something wrong. This is one of those nights, and it happened to a real person, a real man, working a real job. A man named David. Have you ever worked a job where the silence becomes your only companion? Where the hours stretch out like something is pulling time apart, second by second, minute by minute, and the only proof that the world still exists outside is the occasional pair of headlights cutting through the dark beyond the windows? David had that job. For months he worked the graveyard shift at a small gas station, not in the city, not on a busy highway, but in the middle of nowhere. The kind of place where the trees crowd in close on both sides of the road and the nearest neighbor is miles away. The kind of place that, in daylight, seems perfectly harmless. Just a little store, a couple of gas pumps. But at night? At night, that little store became something different, something isolated, something vulnerable. David's shift ran from 11 at night to 7 in the morning. 8 hours, alone. This was years ago, before every gas station had high-definition cameras on every angle, before panic buttons wired directly to police dispatch, before any of that. The owner had some basic security, sure, a camera here, a lock there, but the man was cheap, and David knew it. If something went wrong, he was largely on his own. Most nights, nothing happened. A trucker would roll in around 2 in the morning for coffee and cigarettes. A teenager might show up to grab a soda. Maybe a drunk couple on their way home from somewhere they probably shouldn't have been. Nothing out of the ordinary, nothing frightening. David had learned to fill the time. He'd lean against the counter, magazine open in front of him, the fluorescent lights buzzing softly overhead. A sound so constant, so persistent, that after a while his brain simply stopped registering it. Like white noise, like the hum of the universe itself. He was comfortable. He was bored. He was completely unprepared for what was about to walk through that door. It was past 2 in the morning when it happened. The store had been completely silent for over an hour. No cars, no footsteps. Nothing but that soft, relentless fluorescent buzz and the distant sound of wind pressing against the glass door. David had almost dozed off. His eyes were heavy. The magazine in his hands had stopped making sense 20 minutes ago. He was somewhere between wakefulness and sleep, that strange, weightless place where the world blurs at the edges. And then, a single door chime, clean, bright, wrong. The front door chimed. David's eyes snapped open. He straightened. Habit, professional reflex. He looked toward the door with the automatic, half-asleep expression of someone about to say, "Welcome in, can I help you?" He never got the words out. A man walked in. He was tall, broad-shouldered, built like a former athlete, someone who had once been powerful and still carried that physicality in the way he moved, the way he held his frame. Early 30s, David guessed. Strong jaw, dark hair. Under any other circumstance, David might have barely glanced at him. But David's eyes traveled lower, and the world stopped. The man was covered in blood. Not a little blood, not a scrape, not a cut, not the kind of thing that might have a simple explanation. A lot of blood. It streaked down his forearms in dark, dried rivulets. It was smeared across his chest in a wide, violent pattern, the kind of pattern that doesn't come from a single wound, but from something much worse. There were flecks of it across his face, along the side of his neck. David's brain, still half fogged from near sleep, tried to make it make sense. Paint, maybe?
Some kind of dye? A Halloween costume, perhaps, though it was months past October. But even as those thoughts flickered through his mind, something deeper, something older and more animal, was already screaming. That is not paint. That is blood, real blood, and there is far, far too much of it. David later said that the sheer volume of it was almost cartoonish, like something out of a horror movie. And that was the most disturbing part, because his brain kept insisting it couldn't be real, that nothing that looked like that could be real. It was a defense mechanism, he thinks now, a way of keeping himself from completely shutting down. Because if it was real, if all of that was real, then somewhere, not far from that gas station, something terrible had happened. And the man responsible for it had just walked through the front door. David stood very, very still. The man hadn't said anything yet. He was simply standing there, a few feet past the door, letting it swing shut behind him. His head was slightly lowered. His arms hung at his sides. And then, slowly, he looked up. His eyes found David's. David would describe those eyes for years afterward, to anyone who would listen. He would struggle every time to find the right words. Not angry, he'd say, not scared, not confused or frantic or wild. Empty. They were empty, like no one was home, like the person behind those eyes had gone somewhere else entirely and left only the shell standing there, covered in someone else's blood, staring at a gas station clerk in the middle of the night. And the worst part, the detail that David says has never left him, not in all the years since, was that the man looked completely calm. Relaxed even. Like he had simply stepped out on a Tuesday night to grab some snacks. Like the blood coating his body was so ordinary, so unremarkable to him, that he hadn't even bothered to acknowledge it. For a long moment, David couldn't tell if it was 5 seconds or 5 minutes. Neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. David's hands were flat on the counter. He could feel his own pulse in his fingertips. His breath had become very shallow, very quiet, as though some instinct was telling him not to make a sound, as though any movement might trigger something irreversible. He was staring. He knew he was staring. He couldn't stop. And then the man noticed. Something shifted in those empty eyes, a flicker of awareness, like a light being switched on in a dark room. And then, impossibly, horribly, the corner of his mouth curled upward. He smiled. Not a nervous smile, not an apologetic one, not the smile of a man who has been in an accident and is trying to reassure a frightened bystander. It was slow, deliberate, like a man who knows exactly what effect he's having. And then he spoke. "Don't worry," he said, quiet, calm, almost kind. "It's not my blood." Let that line breathe. Silence is your most powerful tool here. For a moment, David's mind simply refused to process what he'd just heard. "It's not my blood." As though that was reassuring. As though knowing the blood didn't belong to the man in front of him somehow made the situation better. It didn't. If anything, those 4 words were the most frightening thing David had ever heard in his life. Because if the blood wasn't his, then whose was it? And where were they now? David is not sure to this day how he did what he did next. Every alarm in his body was screaming. Every rational thought he had was telling him to run, to hide, to do anything other than stand there behind that counter and pretend that everything was fine. But he didn't run. He nodded, as casually, as naturally as he could manage. As though the man had just made a remark about the weather, David nodded and looked back down at his magazine. He has no idea what was on the page. He couldn't see it. His vision had narrowed to a kind of tunnel, tracking the man's movements in his peripheral vision, while his eyes pretended to read. The man moved through the aisles. His footsteps were unhurried. He browsed. He picked up items and set them back down. He moved through that small gas station store with the slow, easy confidence of someone who had nowhere to be, and all the time in the world. David tracked every step. He watched the man's hands in the reflection of a glass cooler door. He measured the distance between them. He noted, without letting his eyes move, the location of the phone under the counter. He began to plan. If he moves toward me, I step back. If he reaches over the counter, I run. The man placed his items on the counter. A bottle of water, a candy bar, something small and ordinary, as though he'd just come in for a snack. David rang up the items. He kept his eyes down. He did not look at the blood. He did not look at the man's face. He barely breathed. The man paid in cash. He said nothing else. He took his bag, and he walked out. The moment David heard the door swing shut, he reached for the phone. He didn't hesitate. He didn't talk himself out of it, didn't convince himself he might be overreacting. He had just stood 2 feet away from a blood-soaked man at 2 in the morning in a gas station in the middle of nowhere, and somewhere out in the dark, that man had a car. He dialed 911. The dispatcher picked up. David kept his voice low, fast. He was already describing the man, height, build, the blood, the direction he'd walked, when he heard it. The door chimed again, almost a whisper, quiet panic. David looked up, and his heart stopped. The man was back. He was standing in the doorway, one hand still on the door, and his face. That calmness was gone. In its place was something far worse. He was furious. Dark, seething, barely contained fury. The kind that is somehow more frightening than screaming because it is controlled, deliberate. The kind of rage that has already made a decision. He must have seen David through the window. He must have seen the phone pressed to his ear, seen the way David flinched the moment the door opened. He knew. David hung up the phone. It was already too late. The man stormed toward the counter. He demanded to know if David had just called the police. His voice was low and dangerous and utterly certain of what the answer was. David lied. He said no. He said his hands were shaking as he spoke, and he doesn't know how the words came out at all. The man didn't believe him. For a fraction of a second, the world held very still, and then the man lunged. He cleared the counter in one motion, just vaulted over it like it wasn't even there, and he hit David like a freight train. They went down together. David hit the floor hard, the breath slammed out of his lungs, and before he could even understand what was happening, hands closed around his throat. David had never been in a fight, not a real one, not this kind. He had no training, no experience, nothing to fall back on except pure animal desperation. He kicked, he clawed, he twisted his body sideways, trying to break the grip, trying to create even a single inch of space. He scratched at the man's face, his arms, anything he could reach. The hands tightened. The edges of his vision started to go dark. And in that moment, in that final desperate fraction of a second, David did the only thing he could think of. He screamed, "I have a gun! I will shoot you! I have a gun!" He didn't have a gun. There was no gun. There had never been a gun. It was a bluff born of pure terror, the last card a dying man plays when every other option is gone. And somehow, it worked. The pressure on his throat disappeared. The man scrambled backward, off of David, across the floor. He got to his feet, and for just a moment, just one single moment, he looked down at David with those empty, unreadable eyes. Then he turned and ran. Seconds later, David heard a car engine roar to life outside. Tires on pavement, the sound of speed, and then silence. David lay on the floor of that gas station for a long time. He didn't move. He didn't call out. He just lay there in the glare of those fluorescent lights, staring up at the ceiling, breathing. Just breathing. He was covered in blood, not his own. The blood that had transferred from that man's hands, his arms, his clothing during the struggle. Someone else's blood. An unknown person's blood. He thought about that. He tried not to, but he did. Somewhere out in the dark, past the gas pumps and the tree line and the long, empty road, was the source of all that blood. A person, or what had once been a person. The police arrived about 10 minutes later. They were professional, efficient, thorough. They took David's statement. They photographed the scene. They put out a description of the man and the vehicle. They told David he'd done the right thing by calling when he did. Then they left. And after that, nothing. No news report. Not the next morning, not the next week. No follow-up call from the police. No detective visiting to ask additional questions. No trial, no arrest record, no resolution of any kind. Nothing. David waited. He watched the local news obsessively for weeks. He searched for any reports of violence from that night in that area. A missing person, a homicide, anything. Nothing. He even called the police station once, following up on the incident. The officer who had taken his report seemed confused, then non-committal, then said someone would call him back. No one ever did. He doesn't work at gas stations anymore. He never went back to that one. He drove past it once, months later, just to see, just to confirm it still existed, that the night had been real. The store looked the same. The pumps were the same. The fluorescent lights were still buzzing in the windows. He didn't stop. The question that remains: there is something uniquely terrifying about a story with no ending. We are wired for resolution. We need to know that the danger passed, that the monster was caught, that the blood was explained. We need the story to close, to conclude, to make sense. But some things don't close. Some nights don't resolve. Somewhere out there is a man, or the memory of a man, who walked into a gas station in the middle of nowhere, covered in blood that did not belong to him, and smiled. Who looked a frightened young clerk in the eye and said, calmly, as if it were the most normal thing in the world, one more time, slower than before, "Don't worry, it's not my blood," and then disappeared into the night. David never found out whose blood it was. He never found out what happened. He never found out if that person, the person whose blood was spread across a stranger's chest and arms and face, was ever found alive. Some doors open in the middle of the night and let in things that were never meant to be seen. David was lucky. He survived his door. Not everyone does.